Chapter 7, Part 3. Proof number 1. Psalm 2:7. The Son was begotten by God. Quote, "Thou art my Son. This day have I begotten thee." Psalm 2:7, Acts 13:33. God is not begotten. The Son of God is said to be begotten 9 times in the King James Bible. In 1 John 4:9, we are told that, quote, "God sent his only begotten Son into the world." There is general consensus among theologians that when Scripture speaks of the Son of God as being begotten, it is not a reference to his generation as a human on earth, but rather as a spirit person in heaven prior to his earthly incarnation. In this chapter section, we shall take a detailed look at the definition, colloquial meaning, and usage of the word begotten, because within it lies powerful and undeniable proof that Jesus is not God. Our study of this word will be extensive. Again, this is made necessary by the myriad twistings and turnings of Trinitarianism in its unrelenting attempts to distort, obscure, and confuse the straightforward meaning of this word as used by Scripture in describing the origin of the Son of God. Simply put, begotten means to have been caused to exist in the manner of a parent its offspring. Webster. The underlying thought is that of having had a point of origination, a moment in time at which existence began. The idea of having been brought into existence, begotten, is diametrically opposed to the idea of having existed without beginning for all of eternity. In the Bible, only God is said to have existed without beginning for all of eternity. As one caused to come into existence by God, the Son cannot himself be God. To say the Son of God was begotten, made, created, or otherwise brought into being is to say that he is not God. This is all this chapter section has to say, and all it seeks to prove. You would think that Trinitarianism had no argument for this. After all, if one of the defining attributes of God is that he has existed for all of eternity without causation or origination, and if Scripture says that the Son of God was caused to come into being, then it would stand to reason that the Son cannot be God, wouldn't it? But then, as we have observed, Trinitarianism is quite willing to abandon reason when its purposes are served in so doing. We are about to discover that this is precisely what Trinitarianism has done here, while counting on confusion over the meaning of the word begotten for its success. It is, therefore, critical that we understand the definition of this word. The definition of beget. The English word beget, of which begotten is the past participle, is defined by various dictionaries as to cause to exist, to bring into being, to make, to generate, to produce, etc. It is used in the sense of producing a child and also in the sense of causing non-personal entities to exist, such as in the phrase, violence begets violence. In all instances, the word beget depicts a causing to come into being of something which did not previously exist. This is true even when used in the sense of adoption, for in adoption, it is the relationship between offspring and adoptive parent which is caused to come into existence. The Greek root word for begotten in the New Testament is genomai, Ginomai. It is defined by the New Strong's Concise Dictionary of the Words in the Greek Testament, number 1096, as, quote, to cause to be, generate, i.e., to become, come into being. We shall soon further study the Hebrew word translated begotten, but for now, please accept that when Scripture speaks of the Son as being begotten of God, Psalm 2:7, 1 John 4:9, etc., whether in English, Greek, or Hebrew, it is always a reference to his being caused to exist, generated by God. That is the single and unambiguous meaning of the word. The multi-layered, self-contradicting answers of Trinitarianism. As is usually the case when confronted with clear and obvious biblical reasoning against its position, Trinitarianism responds to the true meaning of begotten, as used in Scripture to describe the origination of the Son of God, with not just one false argument, nor even a linear series of false arguments, but rather with a kind of interwoven tapestry of false arguments, which are very difficult to isolate and expose. But isolate and expose them we shall. Trinitarian counterargument number 1. Quote, John 3:16 doesn't say begotten. The good news here is that we won't need to spend a lot of time on this first thread in the Trinitarian tapestry of false argumentation against the meaning of begotten, because it will be contradicted by Trinitarianism itself in its later arguments. Strange, but true. The argument attempts to convince those who are largely unfamiliar with Scripture that the whole idea of the Son of God being begotten is merely an unfortunate mistranslation. It does so by referring to, among other things, the most universally recognized verse of the New Testament, quote, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. John 3:16. When confronted with the teaching that Jesus is the eternal and uncreated God, people will ask, if he was begotten by God, then how can he be God? To which Trinitarianism responds that the original Greek word translated only begotten doesn't really mean that, but rather means only Son, that it merely intends to designate Jesus as God's unique offspring. A great many modern Trinity-biased translations present us with this correction: CEV, GW, TLB, NIV, RSV, etc. And yet, there is anything but consensus among biblical scholars that this is the case. Many English versions hold that only begotten is the correct translation. ASV, AMP, Darby, KJV, WYC, YLT, etc. Furthermore, for hundreds of years after the time of Christ, Greek-speaking writers translating John 3:16 into Latin used the word unigenitum, UNIGENNITUM, meaning only generated, not only Son. Another Trinitarian smokescreen. Again, this whole argument is a pointless waste of words, for, as we shall soon discover, the idea of the Son of God being begotten is explicitly stated in Old Testament prophecy and often referred to in New Testament Scripture. Not only that, but the idea of his being begotten is a key element of the foundational 4th century Trinitarian proclamation, the Nicene Creed, which states that the Son was, quote, begotten, not made. Trinitarian counterargument number 2, quote, the Son of God was eternally begotten. Okay, you may want to dig out your rubberized hip boots again for this one. The stuff's about to get really deep in here. After going to great lengths to obscure the idea of the Son's begottenness among those unfamiliar with its biblical presentation, Trinitarianism now reverses itself and happily acknowledges that the Bible does indeed state that the Son was begotten. But not to worry, Trinitarianism will also throw a brand new element of confusion into the mix. And here is where the interwoven threads of this tapestry of error make it so difficult to get at the biblical truth of the matter. So please give me a little leeway as I attempt to unravel them. Psalm 2:7 declares that the Son was begotten by God. Let's begin with the Old Testament scripture, which is universally recognized among Christians to contain a prophetic declaration that the Son was begotten by God. Quote, Jehovah said to me, Thou art my Son, this day have I begotten thee. Psalm 2:7, ASV, etc. Psalm 2:7 is part of a class of prophetic scriptures which are recognized as having more than one level of meaning. At its primary level, King David is telling us that God said that on that day he had begotten him through adoption. God meant this to be a warning to David's enemies that he had a really big friend. David already existed, but now, as God's adopted son, he had become entitled to his father's special care and protection. At a secondary level, it is perceived to be a statement made by the pre-incarnate Jesus, uttered prophetically by David, declaring that God had begotten him. We have two sources which support this understanding. One, many Bible commentaries agree that it is true. For example, quote, the words may be applied to Christ, Benson's commentary. Quote, this declaration of the Messiah himself, Barnes notes. Quote, tradition claims the passage in a messianic sense, Ellicott's commentary. Also, the JF&B, Treasury of David, Matthew Poole commentary, etc. 2. The New Testament declares it to be true. Acts 13:33 and Hebrews 1:5 and 5:5 proclaim Psalm 2:7 to be a prophetic utterance made by Jesus, nor is there any way to confound the meaning of the Greek word translated begotten in this case, since it is a direct New Testament Greek translation of the Hebrew in Psalm 2:7, there being no ambiguity in the Hebrew word at all. Yalad, the word translated begotten in Psalm 2:7. The Hebrew word rendered begotten in Psalm 2:7 is Yalad, Y-A-L-A-D, which is defined by the Strong's Concise Dictionary of the Words in the Hebrew Bible as, number 3205, quote, to bear young, to beget. Barnes' notes on the Bible describes Yalad as, quote, meaning properly to beget as father. There is no alternate meaning for this Hebrew word. It simply means caused to exist as a parent producing offspring. This is the sense in which it is used throughout the Old Testament. And so, when the New Testament makes reference to the use of begotten in Psalm 2:7, there is no question that it is declaring that the Son of God was literally begotten by God. Does Psalm 2:7 refer to Jesus' human birth? The only argument left to Trinitarianism here is to claim that the words "this day" in Psalm 2:7 refer to Jesus' human birth. The closest statement that I could find was in the pulpit commentary, which says, "the day when Christ commenced his redemptive work." While this does not claim that Psalm 2:7 refers to Jesus' human birth, it does place it within his time on earth. But several respected New Testament commentaries disagree with the idea that Psalm 2:7 refers to the human incarnation of God's Son. Among them, quote, "which act of begetting refers not to his human nature, in which he is never said to be begotten, but always to be made." Gill's exposition. Quote, "this day refers to the time before the creation of the world." Barnes notes, quote, "this day signifying all eternity, there being no yesterday, no tomorrow in eternity, but all being as one continued day." Benson commentary. If the Son was begotten by God, he cannot be God. Can we stop beating this expired, solid-hooved, herbivorous quadruped now? That's dead horse, for those of you in the cheap seats. Yalad, through all of its various renderings in English translations of the Bible, such as begotten, made, brought forth, born, created, etc., means to bring into being. If the pre-incarnate Son was brought into being by God, then he cannot have existed eternally as God. Eternally begotten? The argument itself is based upon the erroneous idea that the Son's begetting by God is a continuous action taking place throughout all of eternity. In the process of approaching this idea, we needed to clarify that Trinitarianism does admit that the Bible, in recognition of the dictionary definition of begotten, declares that the Son of God was caused to come into existence. Hence, the discussion of Psalm 2:7 and its subsequent references in the New Testament, which ensued. Having had that discussion, we are now free to consider the next, rather startling, thread in this Trinitarian tapestry of deception, as represented by Trinitarianism. We begin with a review of the argument that the phrase, "this day have I begotten thee," refers not to a specific day in time, but rather to a state of, quote, eternal generation. Quote, "the words may be understood as referring to his eternal generation, this day signifying all eternity, there being no yesterday, no tomorrow in eternity, but all being as one continued day." Benson's commentary, quote, "designates eternity, one continued day." Gill's exposition, quote, "the words may be properly understood concerning Christ of his eternal generation, this day from all eternity, because in eternity it is all as one continued day, upon which account one day is said to be with the Lord as long as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as short as one day. 2 Peter 38, Matthew Poole commentary. Note, Matthew Poole presents a false argument here. 1,000 years is still a finite period of time, not another way of saying forever. Peter is not telling us that one day with the Lord is the same as eternity, but rather that God is able to experience one day as though it had the same duration as would be our experience of 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as though a single day. Nothing in Peter's words supports the idea that the term this day means eternity. Rather, Mr. Poole, as well as other like-minded commentators, is twisting the meaning of the verse in order to make it appear to support the Trinitarian point of view. As refuted by Trinitarianism, the reason for such a ludicrous Trinitarian argument is obvious. If the true meaning of the begetting of the pre-incarnate Son is allowed to stand, then he cannot be the eternal God by whom he was begotten. Yet the idea of an eternal begetting is refuted by many biblical authorities, Trinitarian and non-Trinitarian alike. Quote, "The doctrine of the eternal sonship of Christ is anti-scriptural. I have not been able to find any express declaration of it in the scriptures. To say that the Son was begotten from all eternity is absurd, a positive self-contradiction." Trinitarian Methodist Adam Clark. Quote, "The words 'this day' refer to the time before the creation of the world. They cannot be construed as meaning the same as eternity or from eternity, and therefore they can determine nothing respecting the doctrine of eternal generation." Trinitarian Albert Barnes, Notes on the Bible. Quote, "It is impossible to find a single text in all of Scripture to prove the eternal generation of the Son." 17th century non-Trinitarian theologian John Milton. Quote, "The term eternal generation is no more intelligible than hot ice, married bachelors, or square circles." Jesus was a non-Trinitarian, author and church leader Sir Anthony Buzzard. Quote, "The Bible has nothing whatsoever to say about begetting as an eternal relationship between the Father and Son. The notion that the Son was begotten by the Father in eternity past, not as an event, but as an inexplicable relationship, has been accepted and carried along in the Christian theology since the 4th century. A Systematic Theology of the Christian Religion, page 110, J.O. Buswell, former Dean of the Graduate School, Covenant College, St. Louis, Missouri. And finally, quote, "The well-known teaching of the eternal generation of the Son had its beginning with Origen, 185 to 254 AD. A Short History of the Early Church, page 29, H.R. Boyer, Erdman's publication, 1976. As presented by the Catholic Encyclopedia. It is interesting to note what the Catholic Encyclopedia, in its article, The Blessed Trinity, has to say. Quote, "Begotten of the Father by an eternal generation, yet, notwithstanding this difference as to origin, the persons are co-eternal and co-equal." The word generate is, for our purposes, semantically equivalent to the word beget, in that they both refer to something being caused to exist. So, what difference as to origin is the Catholic Encyclopedia talking about? God is perceived by Christianity to be without origin, and in this statement, the Catholic Encyclopedia acknowledges that Jesus did have an origin. The only difference as to origin between the Father and the Son is that the Father has existed eternally, hence he is God, and the Son was caused to come into existence, created, hence he is not God. Eternally begotten, a meaningless absurdity. Not only is the idea of being eternally begotten found nowhere in the Bible, but it wholly contradicts itself. We have learned that beget is defined as to cause to come into existence. This means that existence began at a moment in time, and that prior to that moment, the entity did not exist. Eternity is defined by Random House Dictionary as an endless period of time, by the Collins English Dictionary as infinite time, and by the Merriam-Webster Learner Dictionary as time without end. Note that eternity is not defined as being outside of time, but as being time itself, with no beginning and no end. The ideas inherent in the words eternal and begotten are mutually exclusive and contradictory. Something can be eternal, or it can be begotten. It cannot be both. Eternity goes in two directions. Furthermore, if the Son could be said to be eternally begotten, this would mean that he is continuously brought into being throughout the eternal past, in the present, and for all of the future. He would have been being caused to come into existence. This idea is not only unprecedented in human thought, it is patently absurd. But you can't have it both ways. Either the Son's begetting occurs continuously throughout all of eternity past, present, and future, or it only occurred once, at a single moment in the past. So, which is it? Eternally begotten, ludicrous, self-contradicting gibberish. The idea of the eternal generation of God's Son is found nowhere in the Bible. It is ludicrous, self-contradicting gibberish, nothing more than an abortive attempt to obscure the true meaning of David's words found in Psalm 2:7. Just one more journey through Alice's looking glass. Would that biblical theology were the wonderland Trinitarianism so wishes it to be. Taking Psalm 2:7 at face value. I have an idea. How about if we simply take the statement, "This day have I begotten thee," as it refers to Jesus, at face value, as a statement that God's first and most beloved Spirit Son was brought into being at a specific moment in the past, rather than as presenting us with an idea found neither in the Bible nor in all of rational thought, namely, that the beginning of God's Son takes place during all of eternity past, present, and future. Trinitarian counterargument number 3. Begotten by God means the Son is God. Let me ask you a question. If Bob begets a son, is that son also Bob? This is not a trick question, and the answer is obviously no. The son of Bob is not Bob the Son, nor equal with Bob, nor a second person within Bob's being. Bob's son will have his own personality, talents, abilities, strengths, and weaknesses. In some ways, he will be exactly like Bob, but in some ways, he will be completely different. In any case, he is not Bob. He is Bob's son. Similarly, if God begets a son, he will not be God the Son, nor is there any reason to suppose him to be equal with God, nor to be a second person within God's being. He will be a different person than God. He will be God's son. Nor is the concept of sonship limited to just one person in the Bible. Angels, Genesis 6:2-4, Job 38:7, Adam, Luke 3:38, and saved human beings, John 1:12, Romans 8:14, Philippians 2:15, 1 John 3:1-2, are all called sons of God in the Bible, and therefore, by definition, begotten of God, yet none are said to be God. So, how is it that Trinitarianism insists that the begotten Son of God, Psalm 2:7, is God? Proof number 1. Conclusion. In depicting Jesus as begotten, the Bible clarifies that he is a created being, not the eternal and uncreated God.